Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Josh Gould from ARPA-E, and we've got what looks to be a very exciting hour ahead of us. As most of you on the webinar probably know, ARPA-E wants to fund the best ideas for technology to transform the way we generate, store, and utilize energy. And so not surprisingly, a lot of these great ideas come out of universities. So we've got a guest on the webinar today who is very well positioned to speak to the experience of developing a technology while at a university. Specifically, Professor Leland is well positioned to share his experience of going through the many steps from IP to technology transfer to dealing with the private sector in its many shapes and forms to see that his idea made it out into the world. And so in just a second, I'm going to turn it over to Leland, who will tell us about his experience. But before we do that, I just want our audience to know that the majority of this session is about addressing your questions and comments. That's the whole reason we chose this topic. We chose this topic because we at ARPA-E spend a good chunk of our time here at and with academic institutions and folks at those institutions who are trying to accomplish similar objectives to what Lee has done. And therefore, many of you are encountering similar challenges. And so that's why we really strongly encourage you to add your own questions. You should see a bar in the webinar to add your questions. Please do that at any time. We're looking at them, we're reviewing them, and we will tee up as many of those as possible for Lee to address in the webinar. And a final housekeeping note is that a recording of today's webinar and a copy of the slides will be available within about a week on the ARPA-E website. So everyone who's registered and who's on the webinar today should see an email later today with the appropriate link. And so before... One second. Okay. So before we kick off, Lee has a brief introduction and presentation to tell you a bit more about about himself and his experience. So without any further ado, and assuming our webinar technology here is working, I'll hand it over to Lee.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, except I guess those on the West Coast. It's still good morning. So it's my pleasure to be with you, and consistent with what Josh just said, I'm going to splash some initial things up, but my thought is that most of the value for you folks will come in discussion. So let's proceed. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit just so you understand my experience and motivations, talk a little bit about a company I co-founded, talk about my experience with technology transfer and IP, and add a couple of other perspectives, and then we'll go into the Q&A. So when I say here that my career is oriented along an axis of ends rather than means, you know, I'm trained in biology and engineering, but at a certain point, I'm 55 years old, at a certain point you sort of become what you do, not what you were trained as only. And I've oriented my career around producing transportation fuels from plants you can't eat, and that's really the end. And at various times, and in a sort of cumulative way, have picked tools off the shelf that seem relevant to what I perceive to be some of the big problems and opportunities in that area. So we literally do some aspects of molecular biology, and I dare say even are leaders in a few defined frontiers in molecular biology. We do quite a bit of engineering. This is my academic research group now I'm speaking of, and also do global resource assessment. And so those don't have any disciplinary coherence, but they do have applied coherence. Perhaps an unusual way to organize things. In any case, that's what it feels like I'm doing. Singularly focused on cellulosic biofuels since I did my undergraduate thesis in 1979. I just mentioned sort of the diversity of areas. And pretty much this is what I do, and when the world's ready to move, I'm ready to talk, and if not, I keep working on it. It's been my strategy, or it's been what I've done. Not all of this is thought out, but you just keep paddling, and eventually, hopefully, you get across the river. And so, why might I start a company, or really, why do I, work hard? I want to be of service in the context of the sustainable resource revolution. We had a Neolithic revolution where humanity went from primarily hunting and gathering to a farming existence or pastoral, and then from a pre-industrial pastoral existence to a post-industrial, or at least industrial, but pre-sustainable state. So we've had two of these revolutions thus far in resource terms, and we kind of need to be in the midst of the third one, although their signs are mixed. Anyway, that's what I want to impact. Given that desire, it was a fairly obvious thing to start a company, and in fact, I tried to do so in 91 through 95. The timing was not good, and then the opportunity somewhat came to me in 2007. We could talk about that if it's of more interest. 2005, my mistake, and Mascoma was founded in 2006. So it's not like I suddenly got interested. I've been interested a long time, and the world sort of came around to me. Okay, so timing is critically important, obviously, and I don't want to spend too much time saying the obvious, but as I just mentioned, my direct experience was, an idea at the right time. The world's much more receptive than something they're not thinking about yet, and there were a number of factors that led to the doability of a cellulosic biofuel startup in the 2005-2006 timeframe. And so this is from Mascoma's website. One thing I found in my early efforts in the 94 and 95 timeframe, or 91 to 95 timeframe to start a company, was I would go before VCs, and I sensed they would do this calculation, which is, he's not leaving his day job as an academic. He's not mortgaging his house. He's kind of asking me to be more at risk than he is. And I sensed a distinct distaste for that. I think investors like to see that the entrepreneur, the founder, is all in and heavily invested, if not heavily at risk, and that was a factor early on. And that can be a bar for an academic to establish that, I'm asking you to put in $5, $10, $20 million, but believe me, I've got as much in this as you do. They don't want to invest in something that they think you might walk in. Interestingly, the second time around, I think partly because I'd devoted 20 years to the field, that was not a question. I think people kind of felt, well, okay, this guy's obviously he's obviously got skin in the game. It's called life work. So it's just interesting to see how that played out, and we could talk about that more if you like. So there were three founders. I think Bob Johnson's name spelled with an E, by the way, but that's my error because I made up these slides. But Charlie Wyman and Bob Johnson, again, we could talk about the story if you like. The initial exclusive focus was cellulosic ethanol via consolidated bioprocessing. Total venture investment, exclusive of governmental investment, has been about $150 million. And I didn't think, by the way, it would take that much money to, I thought we'd get somewhat further than we got with less money than that. But in any case, initially we had investment from Coastal Ventures and also Flagship. Today, Mascoma employs about 75 employees, and we have introduced the first yeast into the fuel ethanol industry of any kind, happens to be the corn ethanol industry. Initially, we had a build, own, and operate business model, but pivoted to being a technology provider to the renewable fuel industry. Again, we can talk about all of this, but basically, it's not an easy thing to both create an industry and create the technology for the industry. That is, create the commercial industry and also provide it with technology. When Mascoma started, neither existed, but gradually, at least the cellulosic industry has emerged, and that's enabled Mascoma to focus on what we have the deepest experience in, which is providing technology. Now, this has been a case that this field, the climate for advanced biofuels, which is one way to refer to the sandbox we play in, has changed quite a bit. The pendulum has swung overall, I would say, from when Mascoma was founded till now. And broadly speaking, it's I think, swung from positive to negative. Of course, it's not that simple, and there are signs that pendulum, the pendulum seldom stays still, and I doubt it's going to stay stuck where it is. But believe me, you all know this, that any venture is very much a ship on the tide of the perceived potential of their area, and that was a very favorable tide for a while. It's actually a pretty challenging tide right now. So circumstances, opportunities, and companies change, and in fact, the corporate environment is often more dynamic, changes faster than the academic environment, although that can change pretty fast too. But my sense is a lot of academics sort of plan their trajectories, on the one hand grant by grant to be sure, but often succeed in guiding a course that the changes might come in periods of decades. Man, from quarter to quarter at times, things change pretty dramatically in especially startup companies, in my experience. So, as far as IP, and that's just a little background about the experiences that have molded my perspectives, but focusing in on tech transfer and IP, there is, as far as I know, a somewhat unusual agreement, and one that in many ways, in fact most ways, I recommend for consideration. There's other ways to do it. But an unusual IP agreement between Dartmouth and Mascoma. Dartmouth received equity, no royalties, and in addition, yes, that's right, from Mascoma, and Mascoma received rights not only to what I knew at that time, but to other inventions my lab comes up with in the field without new royalty negotiations and the like. My sense of Dartmouth's assessment, and I'm representing somebody else here because I don't speak for Dartmouth, is that in retrospect, I think they feel they would have preferred to have had some royalties as well as equity in the agreement. But actually, I don't think they would have received any royalties to date if that had been the arrangement. Since I don't think Mascoma's earning license from revenues from things developed in my lab, to my knowledge. My assessment is that by the university getting royalties, getting equity rather than royalties, I think the interests of the universities, the inventors, and the companies are better aligned, because when one party wins, the other party wins. The company has to do well for anybody to benefit financially. You don't start arguing about, gee, academic institution thought this was really important, the company doesn't think it's that important. That's not a really pleasant thing to talk about, although maybe somewhat unavoidable sometimes. Also, in a small margin business like fuels, it's quite possible to impede the progress of the technology by royalties. And a very important point, I think this has been very good, although not without risk, for my lab. I actually, for 9 months or so, was the Senior VP of R&D, sort of acting Senior VP of R&D for Mascoma Corporation, and primarily had my office there rather than at Dartmouth. And so I've observed these conversations from both sides of the form, gee, we could do this in-house, more or less, that is in the company. We could also subcontract to a university. Let's look at the pros and cons. There's some advantages to a company doing things in-house. There's also often some advantages to doing them in a university, but I can tell you that if it meant, gee, if they come up with anything, we have to go through a whole new royalty negotiation. Royalty negotiations take time and money no matter whether the invention is applied or not. It can be a significant disincentive. And so this arrangement, in my view, made Mascoma feel quite free to let my lab work on important stuff, because if we came up with something, there was no new negotiation, it was all pre-negotiated. So I think the form of a tech transfer agreement can positively or negatively impact the academics' research opportunities going forward. And I actually had a negative experience with that, although a small one. I had a very active research collaboration with an academic lab, an international one, not Dartmouth. In fact, a very close friendship, and as well as collegial relationship and collaboration with an academic institution internationally prior to Mascoma being funded. In this particular case, Dartmouth negotiated an agreement that included royalties. I warned them at the time. I said, I don't, in this particular area, have skills that the company does not have, and due to the dynamic I described before, I predicted quite accurately that if a royalty agreement was put in place, Mascoma would just do it, and my lab would not do it. And that's what happened. And so essentially a collaboration in that case was essentially killed. That collaboration, the friendship is still there, but the collaboration has never been revived in 6 years, and I think it was because of the way that an intellectual property agreement was structured. So it may not be obvious, and maybe it is, but in my view, how these things are structured, as the point says, really does impact what opportunities an academic will and won't have going forward. So in terms of the landscape, you've got the company, you've got the academic investigator, and you've got the university. And so the company is interested in affordable technology access. They're interested in exclusivity and control for the simple reason that they can potentially, if it's a good idea, they can make an awful lot more money out of it if people can't get it from someone else. They are disinterested in repetitive royalty negotiations, as I mentioned. The company perspective is, and I've heard this from multiple companies, is that inventors and their institutions often overvalue their IP compared to how enabling it actually is. And again, companies have to respond to very dynamic market circumstances, and especially in the startup game, and even larger companies may really change their identity, sometimes in remarkably small periods of time. For the university, they're interested in economic returns. I've had a few conversations with representatives of university IP offices, and I actually think that their biggest priority is to actually have the technology benefit the world. But, as I might have written here and was once said to me, they don't want to look stupid. I mean, if someone does make a whole heck of a lot of money, they don't want to look stupid. Or does not want to look foolish. There's a big difference in my experience, a big range of the degree to which entrepreneurship is and is not, both in stated intent but also in action, a priority amongst different universities. I think some of them have a much more entrepreneurially friendly culture than others. Of course, the academic side, we would like to see something happen with our technology. We'd like to see some economic return. We'd like to have a satisfying experience. We would like to pave the way for future opportunities. And change and loss of control may be hard to accept. I once had a good friend who has been in academia, but also in industry and in the venture capitalist industry, so actually has been in all three parts of the triangle here, say to me that during the period of time he was working with VCs, that his single biggest challenge was dysfunctional technical founders. And as I think I talk about on this next one, there are various ways the ball can roll downhill as a technical founder into a not very functional relationship. You know, going into this, the technical founder knew all about it, and it was their baby, and they had control over it. And gradually, people in the company know more and more about it, and often the governance mechanisms don't let you certainly don't have absolute control. You have to work within the governance mechanisms, and it's I think, a fact that within 18 months or 2 years of when a lot of companies are founded, initially everything's rosy, and often you've got a disgruntled technical founder afterwards. Understanding different parties' interests and realities can be a start to avoiding this, and it takes work. I have sort of set it as a goal to not fall into this gutter and be a functional technical founder, and so far so good. It's been quite a ride with several ups and downs, and overall it's going very well, I might add. But just be aware that this is not an easy thing to do, and that a lot of people have failed at it. And it's obviously not just the founder who fails at it. It's a bilateral or trilateral relationship. So, just a couple of 3 or 4 closing perspectives. There is a very large range of receptiveness and permissiveness of different institutions toward entrepreneurial activity. At Dartmouth, for example, which I consider to be an entrepreneurially friendly place, academics can be equity holding officers. They can be chief executive officers, as far as I know. Many universities don't allow that. I would urge you, even if you have no experience in companies, to let your opinion be known from the beginning. You probably see more than you may give yourself credit for. I think I was a little bit too quiet at the start. But don't expect to be in control. It's probably not going to happen. This is a tricky one and an important one. There's some, and indeed quite a bit of activity that can legitimately be double counted by both academic and entrepreneurial missions and masters. So, for example, if a company funds a grant in my lab with the agreement that the work will be published and that students will be trained and all the rest of it, you know, I can be doing things with the same amount of time and I'm pretty much serving both masters. But there's a lot of activity as well that cannot be double counted, and it is really vital to know the difference. When you should be on the company's meter, when you should be on the academic institution's meter, and whose interest you're representing when. So it is a conflict of interest. It's a manageable conflict of interest, but fundamentally one does need to manage it and deal with it carefully. And then really in general, in professional or for that matter personal life, you know, if you're unfamiliar with the entrepreneurial arena and maybe you're tempted to try to be somebody or something you're not, it won't work. Be yourself. That's always, in my opinion, the most effective strategy. So that's all I have. We've still got 40 minutes left, and Josh, I'm happy to be in dialogue with you, and then it's really up to you to manage how we enter into the Q&A with people who are on the line.
Great. So just to reemphasize here, this is Josh Gould from ARPA-E. You know, the majority of this session is about Q&A from the audience and addressing your questions and comments, and we've got a few in already. So please continue to send it in. There's for those of you who are logged in, there's a chat function on the right-hand side, and we are taking and are looking at Q&A. And Lee, one of the first questions we got in was, you know, you were talking about the importance of the IP agreement, the technology transfer deal with your academic institution. So as it relates to Mascoma, was Dartmouth interested in any upfront cash? So, for instance, to cover the cost of filing patents on your inventions? That's the first question we got in.
Well, there's some aspects of this agreement I don't fully remember. It was a while ago, and there's some that I do remember and probably can't or shouldn't disclose fully, but it's been my experience in general that once an agreement is formed, that companies that obtain intellectual rights to inventions are very often, in fact, I think usually, asked to pay for the prosecution of the patents. That's probably, and that going forward, once an agreement is reached, I think that's probably all I ought to say about that. It's really ultimately several institutions or organizations, businesses, in addition to my own. In fact, primarily, these agreements are between a university and a company. I'm somewhat of a spectator, so I'm going to be a little cautious about details of somebody else's agreement.
No, we completely understand that. So, one of the other questions we had was, it gets to determining whether your idea, you know, you mentioned in your presentation that part of how this all came about is that the world came to you. And so a broader way, I guess, of asking that question, and something we've had that came in was, you know, how did you go about determining whether what you invented was worthy of trying to spin out into a standalone company? You know, what were the indications that let you know that was a worthwhile activity, or you know, in other cases, it may not have been a worthwhile activity? How did you know that?
Yeah, in some ways, my approach wasn't all that systematic. And I tried to indicate, you know, that I pretty much made a commitment to this field, and it's only a slight oversimplification that was pretty much always leaning on the door, and it was closed for a long time, and it already opened, which isn't indicative of a incredibly astute evaluation process. So really, essentially, I was I mean, it was quite a small field until the funding went up, both private and public sector, again in the 2005-2007 time frame. There was this huge ramp up. So I was there doing my thing, wanting to have an impact in the world. Took a flyer at starting a company much earlier. Wasn't actively looking at it continuously, but heck, when my area heated up, I was all ears. Some people contacted me, and essentially the market decided that people were willing to invest. So I'm sorry if that doesn't seem to answer the question, but I think it is really the case that I was pretty much ready when the world was ready, and once they were ready, it happened.
Sure. Yeah. No. There's certainly here at ARPA-E we see all the time that there's activities and interests and movement in the marketplace that no one can accurately predict, and one of all of those externalities can be really impactful as to whether a company, an idea, a technology is ultimately successful. So I think that's an entirely fair answer. Going back to the technology transfer front, one of the questions we got is around technology transfer or IP employees. Whether you felt you were assisted or not, if you were to go back and look at it today, what are some of the key things that a university IP transfer group, a technology transfer group could be helpful in providing to a university inventor like yourself, whether those are services, what sort of help, whether you received it or not, would have been useful to you?
Yeah. So I think let's assume for the moment that the intellectual property organization of the university has a desire to help entrepreneurs. Well, if they do, then one thing they can, first of all, they can, in no particular order, they can make introductions. I know at Dartmouth there's, for example, at the engineering school, there's a network of alums and overseers and whatnot who've invested in more than one spin-off from the Thayer School of Engineering. And so to the extent that such groups can be cultivated, that want to see what's coming out of a university, and then when some inventor comes along and says, hey, I think I might have one here, they can make introductions. That can be very helpful. I think, counseling academics that haven't been through this before, giving them some feedback as to, when what they have might be market ready and when they would do better to write another grant proposal, ways to protect intellectual property as you proceed, going around to let universities and let the academicians know what they should be aware of before they start thinking of a company, to sort of not preclude that possibility. So I think in general, sort of letting the academics know that they're there to catalyze something, to lower the activation energy of something, and that there's interest and receptiveness in all the ways I mentioned. I actually think there's a great deal that a university IP office can do to lower the activation energy and increase the chances of success, both for the company but also to help craft things in ways that are beneficial to the academic. I think collecting experience, not only from that university, but I know that tech transfer people from different universities get together and have conferences and talk about what works and what doesn't work. So there's an awful lot that I think can be shared beneficially with the academics that may know a great deal about their field but are often doing the entrepreneurial thing for the first time.
Sure. And, your presentation today went through a lot of the lessons you learned of things to do when you're the person inventing the technology and helping to spin it out. One great question we have is, what are the top 2 to 3 things to not do? What are the mistakes to avoid? You mentioned the royalty trap and ensuring that the incentives of the parties are aligned. Are there other traps or key key problems to avoid in your experience?
Well, let me think about that for a minute. It's a perfectly good question. And I mentioned this, I would avoid having the expectation of being in control. I don't think it happens often. And that can be pretty disappointing if you go in with that expectation.
Yeah, that's okay. We can. Oh, go
I
ahead.
would be very careful to have and I don't mean to imply I didn't, but I'd be very careful to have, to both personally trust the people that you end up being reliant upon, and there's a whole network of people you're reliant upon when you start a business, the people you're working with, the people that you're getting money from, etc. But I would also pay attention to aligning interests and be thoughtful about what the interests of the other parties are. You know, their interests may be involving you or you know, corralling your technology, etc. And I'm not saying look for problems, but go in open-eyed about, you know, what the various interests are and what various people's criteria for success are, and try to make as sure as you can that those are aligned.
And so speaking of alignment of interests, alignment of incentives, we have a good question from someone who cited Brad Feld, who's a VC primarily in the technology space, who suggested 3 challenges to startups at universities. The first being a lack of rewards within the university incentive structure. The second being a lack of resources, and the third being a lack of cross-campus collaboration, you know, across the university. So, to what extent do you agree with that? And, you know, whether you agree with it or not, what, if anything, does that say about what the tech transfer model should look like, if it should be different than today?
Okay, so the first was lack of rewards. What was the second?
Lack of resources, and the third was lack of collaboration.
Yeah, I think the first 2 for sure. I think that there are probably more good ideas out there than there are people that start companies, and I think part of it is that the people who could start the companies from a technical point of view may not think it's worth the trouble, and that gets to the reward piece. I think resources, both financial and information, is a crucial limiting factor. It's much less clear to me that lack of collaboration across campus, if I understood that correctly, or across an institution. First of all, I think a lot of that happens, but I don't know. That one is less clear to me, but the first 2 really resonate. Yeah.
And so talking about, you know, talking about incentives and whether technical founders want to or are incented by, you know, if they encounter any trouble, are incented to launch companies themselves. You know, how have you encountered in your experience, and this is a question up here, you know, whether to know you're the guy to run the company or not? You know, you mentioned being able and being willing to give up control. You know, how do you determine, yeah, I'm definitely the guy to do it, or no, I'm not? Or in your experience, is someone else telling you that?
Yeah, in my experience, nobody invited me to run the company. But since I'd never run a company and I wasn't prepared to do it full time, I didn't much question that. I frankly don't think I would have done particularly well, and I think it's seldom tried, and not all the times is it tried is it successful. It's not common for the technical founder to run the company, and in general, it's unlikely to be a good idea. Occasionally, it is. I mean, obviously, there are people who start their first company and say, "The heck with this professor stuff. This is more fun or more impactful or what I like." I mean, there are stories like that, but I mean, frankly, I would urge most academics who want to stay academics to look very skeptically at the siren song of, gee, I could run this thing. Well, I guess I would say that I would urge people's default answer to be no, and to be their own skeptic. Technical people should be skeptics. Be skeptical of the proposition you ought to run it, even if someone tells you so, and think about what it means for your lifestyle. Tenured academics have tremendous amount of security. Nobody running a company has that kind of security, especially a startup company. And think about, as clear-eyed away, think about your skill set and your experience. I mean, a lot of people who run companies aren't doing it for the first time, and they learned a lot from the earlier times around the wheel. So I would approach that proposition very cautiously.
Going back to the tech transfer piece, we got a number of questions on a related topic, which is, there is some effort, and how many hours of effort, it tends to depend, but there's some effort in patenting ideas. There's some costs involved in that. You've got to get in most cases, university IP office involved. So did you ever think about the trade-off between the cost and time involved in patenting those ideas versus taking another approach? So, that can involve trade secrets, that could involve, it's probably not the most relevant in this case, but it can involve open source. Did you ever think about the trade-off there between, the cost and time and patenting versus other approaches?
Well, as far as input I've had into Mascoma's activities, definitely. In other words, with my chief scientific officer hat on, it's not always in a company's best interest to patent something, which means you're telling the world what you're doing, and if you're a startup company, it means you're telling people with much bigger resources than yours, both technically and legal point of view. If it comes to haggling over IP, it means you're telling them what you're doing. So while it can be very effective, it's not always a good idea. With my university hat on, one clear line we have is that if we accept funding at a institution that's tax status represents as a non-profit organization, we can't be running a shop in the back room to the benefit of a company. We need to be publishing work. And if you're committed to publishing, really the only way I know of that you can protect something, which I also feel an obligation in the case of where the company funds things, I certainly feel an obligation to protect their interest. So patenting has always seemed like the only option I was aware of for the work at Dartmouth that was headed towards publication. And so honestly, no, I haven't spent much time weighing other alternatives because I haven't been able to identify them, given the circumstances I operate under.
And talking about the different incentives and motivation of academic institution and a startup, one of the things we see all the time at ARPA-E is grad students and those getting their PhD involved in some of these efforts. And we also see that in many cases, to use an overused term, is it takes a village to get something off the ground. So there's a variety of folks, I'm sure, who were instrumental in getting Mascoma, in your case, off the ground. I wonder if you could shed some light on, we've got a question around the PhD or academic, graduate student experience in your project. Were folks involved? How were they involved, and what, if anything, do you think those folks got out of it?
Yeah, so, well, I haven't worked a full day in the lab since 1987, which is neither a point of pride nor embarrassment, but obviously, if things are happening in the lab, given that circumstance, it's by people other than me. So yes, long before there was a company, and throughout the time there's been a company, there have been graduate students involved. I mentioned before that Dartmouth took an equity stake, and the proceeds from that equity, which would have to come with some sort of a liquidation event, are distributed according to a formula which to the inventors, In retrospect, I think that there could have been more, given the nature of our agreement, there could and perhaps should have been more attention paid to inventions and inventions that hadn't yet happened yet, and to ways to reward those people. So I think that's one thing that might have been, that's worth paying attention to. There hasn't been a liquidation event for Dartmouth or for the students, or for me for that matter. So we're all still waiting, and it's unclear how that's going to. It's too early to sort of pass judgment on all of that. But aside from that, all of us who work in universities sign an agreement that the intellectual property created here actually belongs to the university. At least that's the case at every university I've ever heard of. It may be legally required under the various legislative frameworks. I'm not sure. I'm not a lawyer. But I think in general students have enjoyed being part of something that might matter, and it's stimulating to work at the intersection of fundamentals and application. And I think they also enjoy the company interaction, because most of us, whether we're headed towards a career in at least in engineering and applied science, whether we're headed for a career in academia or industry, we would like our work to make a difference, and I think most of us understand that companies are probably a primary vehicle for doing that in most of our fields. And so actually being close to a company and their priorities and watching this interface is stimulating and educational to students. There is a path to students benefiting financially from their contributions, intellectual property they generate, and I think that they also benefit in educational ways. And I've never had a student come and complain that they felt that their interests were somehow being compromised because of a company being involved in funding the lab. Although I've had the reverse. I've had positive feedback from students on that same issue several times.
Interesting. Talking about benefits and benefits back to the university, do you mentioned what you believed. You're not speaking on behalf of Dartmouth here, obviously, but you mentioned what you believed in your presentation Dartmouth thought of the tech transfer deal for Mascoma. Do you know if Dartmouth or others have done a cost-benefit analysis of what it costs to obtain the patents, the IP, and the filings versus what the benefits are in terms of giving it to companies and entrepreneurs? And someone mentioned Penn State doing this analysis. I don't know if you've either seen that or if you can comment on if you were to do a brief cost-benefit analysis in your head, what that would look like.
Okay, let me just respond with an anecdote. A few deans ago, a guy named Duncan used to run the engineering school here, and he was impressed with the founders of Hewlett-Packard, if I'm not mistaken. And he said, his strategy was, if an institution bargains hard for some slice of IP, they're likely to get what they bargained for. If, on the other hand, they're very generous to and not particularly restrictive or even prescriptive to the inventors, their interest in return may be much better. And my understanding is that, I believe it's Hewlett-Packard, it's possible I have this wrong, but that the founders, have given tremendous amount of money over the years to their university of benefactors, probably far, far exceeding anything that the university ever could have bargained for. And so Lewis used to say, I kind of like the idea. You look someone in the eye, you shake their hand, and you say, I hope you are very successful and very grateful. So that's sort of the alternative approach to, we've got our formula and we're going to make sure we get ours.
Yep. Back to Mascoma a bit. You talked about your experience, and you guys started with a build, own, operate business model for the company. One question we've got in here, which I think is a good one and is common for many ARPA-E awardees, is talking a little bit about your experience about changing and iterating on the business model. How did you recognize that you needed to change the business model, and then how did you actually do it?
Okay, so there's two U's here. There's Leland, how did I recognize anything, and then there's Mascoma, how did they recognize, which I'm part of, but a lot else to it. At times the market has a way of communicating rather clearly about your business model. It's called cash flow. I guess the most relevant thing I can say is to just link your question to a comment I made earlier, which was, when Mascoma first started, I pretty much figured I'd never run a business, and so who was I to say? But I did know a lot about the field, and I think I was too reticent. I think I should have spoken up more, and so. The fact that Mascoma still exists is testimony that they've aligned themselves somewhat successfully, at least, with external market realities. Many companies don't last. So I think that's about what I can say without. I don't want to go through actual specific discussions of how business plans changed and who recognized what and who didn't. But it's vitally important, and I think it's quite common for small companies to change their business plan pretty radically, and it can happen with a speed that is really unfamiliar to most academics, really unfamiliar. One other comment, I apologize, it's not directly related to your question, but there really is a different skill set, and not all academics have it. And, when I think about it, it's somewhat of a stereotype, but when I think about a different skill set of academic success and entrepreneurial success, I know a lot of academics that write a lot of proposals with a general formula. Thus and such topic has widely been recognized to be important in the following contexts, and it's generally been understood in these terms, but in fact it's significantly more complicated than that, and I'm the guy to sort it out for you. So in essence, I think that there are many academics who, at some level, benefit from perpetuating and even propagating complexity. And of course, for something to work in the private sector, it needs to deal with complexity where that exists. And this is true in science and in academic work as well as entrepreneurial work, but it's manifested differently. The great technical and scientific work we remember is when people found clarity within complexity. The requirement to find clarity within complexity, I would say, is more stringent in the business world. I think in the business world, without clarity, you're likely to fail. And while the greatest achievements in academia also involve finding clarity and complexity, I know an awful lot of people who get by pretty darn well propagating complexity rather than reducing it. And that's not a success formula in the private sector.
Speaking of the private sector, we have a question about the role of fundraising for a company. Were you involved in the initial funding for Mascoma, and if so, in what way?
Yeah, I made the initial visits to the VCs who eventually invested. And I also, in at least one instance, in a subsequent round, had part of an hour conversation where I believe led to Mascoma's largest single investment. So there was an awful lot of fundraising that happened that I wasn't involved with. But yes, I've seen that side of it, and I was there either alone or with one other person and quite active in the discussions for the initial fundraising.
And thinking about, tying these two topics together here, thinking about being involved in a private entity and being involved in the business world, and then the skills and experiences you have as someone who's at a university. For the folks listening into this webinar who are at a university, what would you suggest are the skills and experiences that those people would do well to develop or try to develop while in a university setting that would enable them to be successful as entrepreneurs or as business people?
There's a pat answer that involves learn a little bit about business, understand the time value of money, etc. But frankly, I think the things that determine business success for an entrepreneur are very intangible. In other words, I think there's some people who don't prepare for it at all and are nevertheless wonderful at it, and there are people who may prepare all their lives and never really get it right. And now that's a waffly answer, but other people would answer this question. Other people would answer this question differently, but honestly, the way I look at it, I think people should figure out what they like and what they're good at, and they should follow those with clarity and persistence. And if that overlaps with the private sector, fine. I think if you sort of drive through the rearview mirror about what do I need to be this or that or the other thing, you're not. I think a lot of the most impactful people don't worry about that too much. They just figure out, look, this is what I want to do, this is how I want to make an impact, and they charge ahead and they make stuff happen. So, again, other people would give very coherent answers that would be very different, but I would say find your passion and your priorities and you're good at and pursue them. And, if you chose well, the rest will fall into place. And that was one thing there's so many different roles you can have within a company and you don't always. Oh, there's another thing. You don't always get to choose. In my experience within companies, people choose each other's roles for each other much more than in academia. And this is part of the control thing. I mean, people sort of tell me where I can make a difference and where I can't, and I don't have too much to say about it. And I've adjusted to that. And so partly because of that, you could prepare for a role in corporate life that nobody would give you. I think it's more important to sort of really figure out a path to impact and pursue it, and then, I don't know, things will work out. If I go back to one of your previous comments, Lee, and think about the question in terms of what do or should folks at universities try to develop in terms of skills or experiences. I mean, when you talked about iterating on the business model, when you talked about figuring out that Mascoma wouldn't best be a build, own, operate business model, that you needed to do something different. It seems, and here I'm paraphrasing, so tell me if I'm wrong, it seems that what you said and how you did that successfully was you listened to what the market was telling you and you listened to what customers or potential customers were telling you. So that seems to be something that's pretty tangible that most folks, if they're willing, would be able to do in terms of going out and talking to the market and talking to customers and using that feedback and active listening to change your business model or technology. Am I paraphrasing correctly? I think paying attention to environment and opportunity and being willing to change, those are real good skills. And they're skills that, as I mentioned, I think are more at a premium in business than in academia, although I can imagine people arguing with that statement, but let's just say they are really at a premium, and those it's more like, it's not so much a skill as it is kind of an approach, perhaps. So I'm not sure it's something you get trained in so much as something that you develop within yourself through life experience. At least some people do it that way. But sure, being paying attention to what's going on and how things are changing and may differ from what you assumed or what you used to think, and being willing to be dynamic. Those are great skills.
Going back to the fundraising question, we got another one on that. Can you comment? The question is, can you comment a bit on what private sector investors look for in a startup in regards to IP specifically? So you had that slide when you walked through, of the different interests of the different parties involved. So tell us a little bit about what you encountered when you went out to investors in terms of what they were asking for or looking for in terms of IP.
What I encountered, frankly, was that the investors had done their homework and I think were predisposed towards investing, which was just only because I showed up at the right time. And so to some extent, the sale was mine to lose rather than to make. So I didn't feel that there was this really difficult set of ultra-critical hurdles. I think the investors thought the time was right and could see or made the conclusion that I could see a path that was of interest to them. I've heard investors give, sort of a list of 3 or 4 points. It's sort of a cliche, but one invests in people at least as much as technology, and I think people often say more than technology. So they're looking for something with a big upside. They're looking for something with good people, and they're looking for something with protectable IP. And those are, I don't know, one might add a couple to the list, but those were considerations in my case. Although, as I said, I think, the stereotype is, you go into a disinterested investor and win them over. I don't think that was my experience. I had very invested investors who'd done their homework and were largely won over when I showed up.
And the last question we have here, back to the IP piece. How did the licensing agreement that Dartmouth had with Mascoma, how did that, if at all, affect your ability to work with other companies as a university researcher?
In the field I'm active in, just trying to remember. Actually, I'm not able to work with other companies in this field. Is the bottom line. So it affected that quite a bit. And that's why I said it was that the kind of agreement I have is not without risk, but in my experience, the good side of the agreement have been much more, that side of the sword is cut much better than any negative side.
But certainly that's something, someone in your shoes would do well to be aware of, I'm guessing. I'm reading into that question.
Sure.
If there's going to be an IP agreement between the academic institution and that you work at and a company, you would do well to think of the impact on your ability as a researcher to work with other companies. Right?
It's a little bit like getting married. I mean, if you make an exclusive commitment to somebody, you have a depth of relationship that you couldn't realize if you were playing the field, but you give something up. I mean, it's a similar trade-off.
Sure. Well, I just want to give one last housekeeping item, which is to remind everyone that we have recorded the webinar. So for everyone online today, we'll be sending you a copy of the slides within a week. And I know, or I'm almost certainly positive that when we do send those slides for the webinar, that we are continuing to look for and ask for feedback about ARPA-E University. And so if there's a topic, that today raised or a topic that we haven't covered in our ARPA-E University, please do let us know. We develop these topics based on your feedback and what we're seeing amongst our awardees. So look for that, and any feedback you have is much appreciated. So with that, I'd really like to thank Dr. Leland, Dartmouth. Thank you so much. I think this was a great webinar, and we really appreciate your participation.
My pleasure. I hope it's been useful to the people who've spent an hour of their time participating.
All right. Thank you.
All right. You're welcome.